The mirror above Evangeline's vanity wept blood. Not her blood. She knew the taste of her own. Iron, sweet, arterial, the metallic ghost that lingered on her tongue after she'd bitten her cheek. This was older, ancient. It moved like living liquid against the silvered glass, tracing patterns she almost recognized, almost remembered, as though some forgotten part of her soul had been waiting lifetimes to read them. She stood frozen in her nightgown, candlelight trembling across the Victorian bedroom that had never felt like home, even after 3 months of inheriting it. The manor breathed around her, settling floorboards, wind through corridors she hadn't explored, walls that seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched her own racing heartbeat. Blackthorn Manor, her great-aunt's legacy, arriving with a solicitor's letter and the weight of secrets no one had bothered to explain. The blood on the mirror began to form letters. Come. Evangeline's breath caught. She reached toward the glass, her fingertips trembling inches from the surface. The moment her skin would have touched it, the blood scattered like startled birds, dissolving into ordinary reflection. Her own face stared back, pale, dark-eyed, terrified in the way that beautiful women were supposed to look in Gothic novels. In real life, terror made you ugly. It hollowed your cheeks and made your eyes too wide, too desperate. She turned away from the mirror. The dream had started 3 weeks before she inherited the manor. Every night, the same one. She stood in a crypt lit by candles that burned with green flames, and across from her stood a man whose face never quite solidified in her memory. She could recall everything about him except his features, the way shadows clung to his shoulders like living things, the precise music of his voice when he whispered her name, though not her name, something older, something that tasted like centuries, the cold elegance of his hands reaching for her in the darkness. Come back to me, he would say, and she would wake gasping, sheets soaked in sweat, her heart convinced it was breaking over someone she'd never met. Her doctor had prescribed rest. Stress, he'd said, writing something in his leather notebook. Inheritance trauma. The mind plays tricks when we're grieving, even for relatives we barely knew. But Evangeline hadn't grieved her great-aunt Cordelia. She'd met her once, at age 7, at a funeral for someone else. Another ancestor, lost to tuberculosis or scandal, or the Victorian habit of dying inconveniently. She remembered only cold hands, eyes the color of storm clouds, a voice that had whispered, "You have the gift, child," the remembering blood. Protect it. Guard it well. When he comes, and he will come, choose carefully. At 7, Evangeline had understood none of it. Now, at 23, inheriting a mansion full of her secrets, she was beginning to. The blood returned to the mirror while she changed into her day dress, a pale, blue thing that made her look even younger than she was. It formed new words, slower this time, as though the sender was growing weaker. Forgive me. So long without you. Who are you? Evangeline whispered to the glass. The response came not in words, but in sensation, a flood of warmth that began at her chest and spread outward, filling her with such sudden, terrible longing that she had to grip the vanity to keep from falling. It tasted like loss. It felt like remembering something that had never happened to her, yet had happened through her, in blood and bone, in the very marrow of her being. She'd found Cordelia's journals in the library, hidden behind false paneling, tucked into leather bindings, written in handwriting that shifted between precise and frantic. They detailed a world Evangeline had thought existed only in penny dreadfuls and Gothic serials. Bloodlines, covenants, the immortal folk, as her great-aunt had called them, though she'd crossed that last word out so many times the paper nearly tore. One entry, dated exactly 143 years ago, had made Evangeline's hands shake. He came for me last night, the fallen one, the Prince of Crimson Sorrows. I felt him in the blood dreams as I always have, but this time he manifested, walked through the crypt door like a man, like something beautiful and terrible, and completely, utterly damned. He wanted me to choose, to bind myself, to drink, to become what he is. I refused. I chose the mortal span instead. But he said something I'll never forget. Then I will wait for you in your bloodline. I will wait in bone and blood and the spaces between heartbeats. When you are born again in your line, when you remember, I will come. And perhaps this time, my love, you will not refuse. The entry ended there. The next page was blank. The one after that contained a single sentence. Evangeline. Call her Evangeline. Let her hear him in the mirrors. Let her dream of redemption she doesn't understand. Now, watching her reflection fracture and reform in the blood-covered glass, Evangeline understood. She'd been born to this, bred for this, waiting for this without knowing it. The blood spelled one more word before fading entirely. Tonight. She spent the day in the library. 7 rooms of towering shelves, leather-bound grimoires, journals written in a dozen languages, sketches of symbols that made her eyes water when she looked at them directly. The mansion had been built in 1743, renovated in 1847. Every date corresponded with some entry in Cordelia's journals. Every corner held a piece of the story. By evening, Evangeline had learned that her bloodline carried a gift, a curse, a connection to the immortal folk that ran so deep it was woven into her cells themselves. And that somewhere, for centuries, a fallen prince had been waiting for her to remember. The candles in her bedroom lit themselves at midnight. Evangeline didn't scream. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed, pulse hammering, and waited. The shadows deepened. The air grew cold enough that her breath emerged in small clouds, and then the crypt doors dissolved like mist. He stood in the candlelight, and even though she'd never seen his face, she knew him absolutely. Every cell in her body recognized him. Every forgotten memory screamed his name. He was tragedy incarnate. Centuries of exile lived in the lines of his face. Beauty and damnation warred across his features. An aristocrat's cheekbones, a saint's eyes, a predator's mouth. He was dressed in black that seemed to absorb the candlelight. And when he looked at her, when their eyes met across the impossible distance between dream and waking, Evangeline felt something in her soul crack open. Evangeline, he breathed, and it was the voice from her dreams, made real, made devastating. I don't know you, she whispered, and it was a lie and a prayer all at once. He moved closer, and she could smell him. Leather and winter and something dark and ancient, like earth after rain, like consecrated ground where something had bled. Not yet, he said softly, but you will. I've waited 143 years for you to remember. And tonight, my love, I'm going to help you remember everything. He reached for her, and Evangeline felt the weight of centuries descend like wings. His hand never touched her skin. It hovered inches from her cheek, trembling with restraint, and Evangeline realized with a shock that terrified her more than his appearance. He was afraid. Centuries of existence, and he was afraid of touching her. If I take your hand, he said, his voice layered with centuries of sorrow, it will begin. The memories surge, the blood remembering. Once you know what I am, what we are, there's no returning to your ordinary life. Your great-aunt understood that. She chose mortality over eternity with me. His storm-cloud eyes, so like Cordelia's, so familiar, fixed on hers. I won't force that choice on you, Evangeline, but I cannot bear another century of waiting in the mirrors and the dreams. She should have been afraid. Every rational part of her screamed to run, to call for servants, to convince herself she was dreaming or mad. But Evangeline had spent 3 weeks reading her great-aunt's journals. She'd already surrendered to the impossible. She reached out and took his hand. The world shattered. Blood beneath fingernails. A cathedral burning. The year 1642. And she is running through stone corridors with a man she loves with a desperation that transcends time itself. And he is screaming her true name, the one she was born with in that life. Magdalena. Holy Magdalena. The priests called her blessed. They didn't know she carried immortal blood. They didn't know. A sword through his chest, a blessing meant to be a curse. Holy water burning like acid on his skin as she cradled him, begging the bishops to stop, to understand. But they saw only heresy and damnation. They burned the body. They tried to burn her. He came back 3 nights later, resurrected and damned, and found her in the catacombs beneath the cathedral. His kiss was agony. His touch was salvation. He asked her to drink from his wrist, to join him in eternal darkness. She refused. 143 years of letters written in blood on mirrors. 143 years of dreams. 143 years of a love that transcended death, but could not transcend her mortal choice. Evangeline gasped and fell backward onto the bed, her entire body convulsing with the weight of memories that belonged to her, but felt like they belonged to someone else. Someone she had been. Someone she had loved with a ferocity that made her current self seem hollow. The man, Lysander, the name rose from the depths of her blood, caught her as she fell, cradling her against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, slow and rhythmic, like the pulse of something ancient and patient. Not a living heart, something else, entirely. Easy, he murmured against her hair. Breathe, my love. The remembering is always violent the first time, but you're strong. You've always been strong. Magdalena, Evangeline gasped out. I was Magdalena. I loved you. I watched you. The memory of his death, the sword, the burning agony of watching him transform into something beautiful and terrible, threatened to split her apart. Shh. He stroked her hair with surprising gentleness for someone who'd just confessed to being damned. That was lifetimes ago. You chose to be reborn, to try again, to find another path. And I honored that choice by waiting. By becoming what I needed to become, someone worthy of redemption, if redemption is even possible for a creature like me. Evangeline pulled back enough to look at him. Now that she could see him, truly see him, she recognized the weight he carried. Not just the physical immortality, but the spiritual one. The knowledge that he'd been meant for something holy and had been perverted into something unholy. A fallen noble in the truest sense. A prince of grace turned prince of darkness. What are you? She whispered. What I've always been, he said. And there was no vanity in it, only tragic acceptance. Damned. But for you, only for you, I've spent centuries trying to be less damned, trying to be worthy of the love you gave me before the fall. He rose from the bed and moved to the window. The moonlight outside was wrong, too red, too heavy. A blood moon, hanging low and obscene in the autumn sky. Evangeline realized she'd never actually checked the calendar. The blood moon wasn't supposed to rise for another 3 weeks. You called it? She said. I've been calling it for 143 years, he replied. Blood magic, love magic, desperation, they all speak in the same tongue when you're immortal enough to wait for alignment. Tonight, the veil between worlds is thin. Tonight, you could hear me. Tonight, you remembered. He turned back to her, and moonlight caught the depths of his eyes, ancient, complicated, full of terrible hunger and absolute longing. Cordelia made me a promise before she chose mortality, he continued. She said if I could go a full human lifespan without feeding on unwilling prey, if I could learn restraint and something approaching redemption, then perhaps when she returned in her bloodline, perhaps the universe would grant us a different ending. She said, Lysander, become worthy of grace, and when I am born again, I will choose differently. He moved back to the bed but didn't touch her this time. I've spent 143 years becoming worthy. I've gone decades at a time on animal blood alone. I've saved lives instead of taking them. I've tried to be something more than hunger and darkness. His voice cracked slightly. And still, I don't know if it's enough. Evangeline felt something shift in her chest. Not just the vampire's call, though she could feel that too, a thrumming in her blood like a second heartbeat, but something deeper. Something that recognized this as the central tragedy of their story. A man trying to redeem damnation, working toward a grace that might never come, holding on to a love that had spanned centuries and multiple lifetimes. What happens now? She asked. Now, Lysander said carefully, you have a choice, the same choice Cordelia had. You can accept what you are, a woman born with immortal blood, connected to the supernatural, called to my side by blood and fate. You can choose to bind yourself to me, to drink, to begin the slow transformation into what I am. Or, he paused, and the pain in his voice was exquisite. You can reject me again. You can live your mortal span and die, and I will wait another century for you to return, and perhaps the next time you will be brave enough to say yes. Outside, the blood moon pulsed like a wound. Evangeline thought of Cordelia, choosing safety over eternal love, choosing mortality over the sacrifice immortality demanded. But she also thought of the journals, the centuries of longing written in blood, the way this man had spent his entire cursed existence trying to become worthy of a woman who refused him. What if, she said slowly, I choose a third option? What if I don't refuse, but I also don't accept the transformation yet? What if I choose to know you first? To understand what we are before I become what you want me to be? For the first time, something like hope flickered across his face. Then, Lysander said softly, I will have to teach you. And you will have to decide if a man who carries the weight of centuries and the curse of immortality is worth binding yourself to forever. He extended his hand. This time, when she took it, there was no vision. Only the cold, certain knowledge that her ordinary life had ended the moment his hand touched hers. The blood moon rose higher. Dawn came gray and reluctant, as though the sun itself was uncertain about breaking through the blood moon's lingering shadow. Evangeline hadn't slept. She'd spent the night listening to Lysander speak. Truly speak. Not the fragmented, bleeding heart confessions of the previous hours, but the careful recitation of a man trying to compress centuries into digestible pieces. He'd told her about 1642, about the cathedral and the priests, and the holy water that had burned him like acid. About the girl he'd loved, Magdalena, saint-born and defiant, who'd refused to damn herself for him. About the centuries of transformation that followed, the slow crawl from pure damnation towards something resembling grace. The hunger never leaves, he'd explained, pacing the candlelit library where they'd moved as dawn approached. That's what they don't tell you in the stories. Immortality isn't a gift. It's a curse that requires feeding, maintenance, constant vigilance against your own nature, every moment I war with what I am. He'd shown her his hands, elegant, aristocratic, utterly beautiful, and explained the strength contained within them. One finger could pierce steel. He could drain a human in minutes if he allowed the hunger to take him. But you don't, Evangeline had said. Not anymore, he'd replied. Not for 87 years. Now, watching him move through her great-aunt's library with the casual grace of someone who'd lived multiple lives, Evangeline realized she was falling in love with him. Not with the beautiful predator, not with the romantic notion of immortal devotion, but with the man beneath both. The one still trying to earn redemption, still fighting against centuries of damnation, still believing that love could matter more than hunger. "The coven will know you've been awakened," Lysander said, pulling a leather journal from the highest shelf with casual, immortal strength. "Your bloodline signature is distinct. When you took my hand, when the memory began to flow, every vampire within 100 miles would have felt it. We have perhaps 3 days before they come." "Who is we?" Evangeline asked, curling deeper into the wingback chair he'd procured for her. "The Crimson Court," he said, and there was bitterness in the name. "Ancient bloodlines, mostly. Vampires who've chosen civilization over the wild dark. We have laws, hierarchies, politics as complicated as any royal court. And there are those who will want you." He said it without judgment, simply stating fact. But Evangeline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the manor's persistent cold. "Want me why?" "Because you're rare," he said quietly. "Your bloodline carries the memory gift, the ability to inherit blood experiences from previous lives. Most vampires are created, made, infected like a disease, but some, very few, are born with immortal blood dormant in their veins. When those bloodlines are awakened, they accelerate faster, stronger, with fewer of the weaknesses that plague the rest of us." He paused, meeting her eyes across the library's shadows. "And because they'll know you're mine, or believe you could be. In our world, Evangeline, a possession is better than a person." She wanted to feel afraid. She should have felt afraid. Instead, she felt a strange clarity settle over her. The same clarity she'd felt when reading Cordelia's journals, when understanding that her entire life had been leading to this moment. "Then we have 3 days to decide," she said. "Decide what?" "Whether I'm willing to become whatever I need to become to stay with you." Lysander went very still. The candlelight caught the ancient depths of his eyes, and for a moment she could see all of it. The centuries, the deaths, the slow martyrdom of a man trying to redeem himself. "You're not required to decide anything," he said carefully. "This isn't seduction, Evangeline. This isn't some dark fantasy meant to bind you. You can refuse me. You can send me away. Cordelia did, and I've spent a century and a half respecting that choice." "Cordelia wasn't me," Evangeline said, "and I'm tired." Lysander tilted his head, confused. "I'm tired of being ordinary," she continued, rising from the chair with sudden decision. "I'm tired of pretending my life means something when I knew, deep in my blood, that I was waiting for something. Someone. I'm tired of the mirrors weeping blood and calling to me in dreams." She crossed the library and stood before him, close enough to feel the cold that radiated from him like a second winter. "I want to understand what I am. I want to know what it means to carry immortal blood. And yes, I want to know you. Not the version from my memories, the one standing in front of me now." He reached out slowly, giving her time to refuse. This time, when his fingers brushed her cheek, the touch was gentle. Not a memory trigger, but an intimacy. His skin was cold, perfectly smooth, and when she leaned into his hand, she felt something in him settle. "Then let me show you," he whispered. "Not the hunger or the darkness, the beauty of what we could be, if you're brave enough to reach for it." He took her through the manor as night fell again, showing her passages she'd never found, rooms sealed behind enchantments that only opened for those with vampire blood. The crypt beneath the house, the one from her dreams, was exactly as she remembered it. Green candles, stone floors worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, an altar at the far end carved with symbols that made her head ache when she tried to read them. "This is where Cordelia came to refuse me," Lysander said softly, and where I'll wait for your answer, if you need time. But Evangeline found her eyes drawn to the altar, to the chalice carved from black stone that sat at its center. She recognized it from her blood memories, recognized the weight of covenant it held. "What is that?" she asked. "The binding cup," he said, "where blood is joined, where I would take your wrist and you would take mine, and in that exchange we would—" He stopped, struggling for words. "We would become bound, not completely immortal, not at first, but connected. The hunger would call to you as it calls to me. You would begin to change, and in time, if you chose it, you could cross over entirely. And if I didn't choose it, if I just wanted the binding without the transformation, then you would live a half-life," he said honestly, "caught between mortality and immortality, aging slowly, dependent on regular blood exchanges to survive. It would be torture." The honesty was almost cruel, but Evangeline appreciated it. This was no seduction, no dark temptation dressed in beautiful lies. This was a man laying out the terms of damnation and asking her to decide if she loved him enough to accept them. Outside, thunder rolled. The blood moon reached its zenith. "I need time," Evangeline said, "to think, to decide." Lysander nodded, unsurprised. 3 days, he said. "Then the coven comes, and your choices become limited." He led her back to her bedroom, and when he left her at the threshold, Evangeline realized she was afraid. Not of him, but of her own certainty. She already knew what she would choose. It was simply a matter of being brave enough to speak it aloud. The mirrors remained clear, mercifully free of blood. But she could feel him in the manor's bones, patient and ancient, and terribly, achingly hopeful. The wound came from her own foolishness. On the second day of her 3-day reprieve, Evangeline ventured into the library's deepest section, the sealed chamber Lysander had shown her, where books bound in leather that might have been human skin held secrets written in languages dead for centuries. She was searching for something specific, a record of the binding ceremony, some precedent for what she was beginning to understand was inevitable. The book she pulled from the highest shelf was old enough that it crumbled at the edges. As she opened it carefully, one brittle page cut her thumb, a thin, sharp line that bloomed with crimson almost immediately. The taste of her own blood filled her mouth, and with it came a sensation like falling. Evangeline gasped and gripped the nearest table. The wound was nothing, barely a scratch, but her entire body responded as though she'd been severed. Her heart raced, her vision swam, and beneath it all, a call, a summons, a hungry whisper that sounded exactly like Lysander's voice. "Come to me. Let me see. Let me taste. Let me—" She bit down on her palm, trying to stem the flow, and that's when he appeared. One moment, the library was empty. The next, Lysander stood in the doorway, his entire body rigid with tension. His eyes had changed. The storm cloud gray had gone black, pupil and iris indistinguishable, ancient hunger radiating from them like heat. "Don't," he said, and his voice was strained to breaking. "Don't move. Don't let me see it." "It's just a small cut," Evangeline said, but she was terrified. This was the first time she'd seen him struggling, truly struggling, against his nature. "Small or not, I can smell it. I can taste it in the air and your blood. Christ, Evangeline, your blood sings to me." He turned away, his hands clenched into fists. "It's not human blood hunger. It's covenant blood hunger, soul hunger. It's telling me to come to you, to bind, to take, to—" He made a sound that was almost a growl. "Leave, go upstairs, now." But Evangeline found herself moving toward him instead. "What if I don't want to?" she whispered. Lysander's entire frame went rigid. "Evangeline, What if I'm ready? The words came out before she could stop them, before she could second-guess her own reckless heart. What if I've already decided, and I'm just waiting for the right moment? What if this is the moment? He turned back to her, and the hunger in his gaze was absolute. She'd seen paintings of saints looking at visions of heaven with less longing. "You don't understand what you're offering," he said, but he was moving closer, drawn by the same pull that sang in her blood. "The binding isn't just intimacy, it's a merging. Your blood will carry my memories, and mine will carry yours. We'll be connected in ways that mortals can't comprehend. There will be no hiding, no privacy, no secrets. I'll feel your emotions. You'll feel my hunger. We'll be entangled at the cellular level." "I know," Evangeline said. She extended her hand, showing him the wound. It was still bleeding, small rivulets of red tracing down her wrist. "I've read enough of Cordelia's journals to understand. And I've had 2 days to think. I've had my entire life, apparently, to think, given that I've lived it before." Lysander looked at her palm like it was the most beautiful and terrible thing he'd ever seen. "If you do this," he said, and his voice was breaking, "there's no going back. Not entirely. Even if you refuse the full transformation, you'll be bound to me. You'll age slowly. Your desires will shift toward immortality. Eventually, the only choice will be to finish what we've started, to drink deeply, to cross over completely." "Then I'll cross over completely," Evangeline said simply. "But I need to know, Lysander. I need to understand what you are, what we could be. And you need to stop punishing yourself with restraint." She brought her bleeding wrist to her own mouth and drank. The taste was copper and electricity, and it opened something in her that had been locked since the moment of her birth. Her blood memories surged again, but differently this time, not invading, but inviting. She was offering him the keys to all of it: Magdalena's defiance, Evangeline's awakening, the centuries of longing, the slow-blooming realization that she'd been created specifically to return to him. And Lysander, beautiful, damned, desperately hopeful Lysander, crossed the distance between them and took her wrist. His kiss was agony and ecstasy perfectly balanced. His fangs, she hadn't seen them before, elegant and terrible as ivory, punctured the wound and drew. Each pull of blood created waves of sensation that had nothing to do with pain. It was intimacy on a cellular level. It was the universe realigning to accommodate their convergence. He drank carefully, reverently, as though her blood was sacrament. She could feel him in her, not as invasion, but as merging. His immortal consciousness brushed against hers, and she gasped at the scope of it. Centuries of existence, countless deaths he'd witnessed, the weight of guilt and penance and desperate, endless hope. When he pulled away, they were both gasping. A thin line of her blood traced his mouth, and he closed his eyes as though tasting it still. "I can feel you," he whispered. "Not the memories yet, but your acceptance, your certainty." "God, Evangeline, how are you so certain?" "Because I remember being uncertain," she said, thinking of Magdalena's refusal, Cordelia's choice. "I've done this before, all of this, and I chose differently. But not this time. This time, I choose you." He pulled her close and she felt the shift in him. Not transformation yet, but settling. As though a part of him that had been fractured for centuries was finding its way back into alignment. "The coven comes tomorrow," he said against her hair. "We have less than a day before the questioning begins, before they decide what to do with you." "Then we should prepare," Evangeline replied, "and tomorrow, if they ask what I am to you, I'll tell them the truth. I'm your covenant bound. I'm the woman you've been waiting for, and I'm no longer mortal." She could feel the change beginning already, her heart beating slower, her vision growing clearer, the hunger starting its ancient whisper in her blood. It would take time to fully transform, but the binding had begun. She was no longer entirely human. She was becoming something new. The blood moon hung low outside the library windows, witnessing. They came at dusk, 3 figures moving through the blood moon's crimson light with predatory grace. From her place at the library window, Evangeline watched them approach the manor gates. 2 men in expensive clothing that probably cost more than her annual inheritance, and 1 woman whose beauty was so absolute it seemed almost weaponized. Lysander stood beside her, perfectly still, his hand resting at the small of her back. The gesture was both protective and possessive, and Evangeline realized that was exactly the point. He was announcing her status before they even entered. "The woman is Countess Seraphine," he said quietly. "She's been nosing around my affairs for 3 centuries. The dark-haired man is Thaddeus. He's curious about most things, but ultimately neutral. The other is Cassius. He's dangerous." "Dangerous how?" Evangeline asked. "He believes immortals should rule openly, that hiding from humanity is weakness. He's tried to recruit me to his cause twice. When I refused, he marked me as an enemy." Lysander's hand tightened slightly. "When he learns you're bound to me, he'll see you as both an opportunity and a threat." Before she could respond, the manor doors swung open. No one had opened them, which suggested Lysander had done so through sheer force of will. The 3 vampires entered without invitation, moving through the foyer with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to deference. Evangeline forced herself to walk downstairs beside Lysander, their hands linked. The moment they came into view, she felt the change in the air, a ripple of shock that was almost physical. "Lysander," the Countess said, her voice like honey poured over broken glass. "You finally emerged from your crusade for redemption, and with—" She turned her storm-cloud eyes toward Evangeline, and the hunger there was immediate and absolute. "Oh, my darling, what is this?" "The princess awakens," Thaddeus said, his tone more curious than lustful. "I thought she was myth. A story to frighten young vampires into restraint." Cassius said nothing. He simply stared at Evangeline with the focused intensity of a predator having spotted injured prey. "Evangeline is bound to me," Lysander said flatly. "The covenant is sealed. The blood has been exchanged. She is no longer subject to scrutiny." "Everything is subject to scrutiny," Seraphine countered, circling Evangeline with predatory grace. "A girl with no bloodline history suddenly awakened?" "No, darling, that requires explanation. Who was her maker? What's her lineage? And more importantly—" She paused, inhaling deeply near Evangeline's neck. "She still smells half-mortal. The binding is incomplete." "By choice," Evangeline said, and her voice surprised her with its steadiness. "I'm choosing to transform gradually, to understand what I'm becoming before I surrender to it entirely." Seraphine's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, that's precious. The bound one speaks. Tell me, little prophet, do you even understand what you've bound yourself to? What he is? What he's become in his desperate pursuit of grace?" "I understand more than you might imagine," Evangeline replied. "I have his memories. I can see what he's done over centuries, and I can see what he's trying to become. That's more than most of you can claim." It was a gamble, a direct insult, made all the more bold by the casual way she delivered it. But she felt Lysander's hand squeeze hers, not in warning, but in something like pride. "The bound one has teeth," Thaddeus observed, sounding genuinely delighted. "Lysander, where did you find her?" "Her bloodline is reincarnating," Lysander said, and Evangeline realized this was a story he'd prepared. "Magdalena, born again as Evangeline. It's a complete return of the bloodline's incarnation cycle. Her great-aunt was the previous iteration, Cordelia, whom I loved and who refused me. This time, Evangeline chose differently. Cassius stepped forward, and the temperature in the room dropped. "That's a problem," he said softly. "Because if the bloodline is cycling, that means she has access to all the memories of every incarnation. That makes her dangerous. That makes her a potential liability to all of us." "She's my bound," Lysander said, and there was a finality in his tone that suggested he would fight to the death to defend that statement. "What she does with her memories is her concern, and mine alone." "Not if those memories include locations of sacred sites," Seraphine interjected. "Not if she remembers the ritual locations, the binding ceremonies, the places where our kind has hidden for centuries. Bloodline memory holders are dangerous, Lysander. You know this. Every coven has hunted them to extinction precisely because they know too much." Evangeline felt the weight of that statement sink into her bones. The journals, Cordelia's journals. She was carrying centuries of covenant secrets, immortal bloodline knowledge, locations and rituals that were clearly meant to remain hidden. "Then it's good that I'm bound to someone powerful enough to protect me," she said, "and clever enough not to let me be anywhere near your precious secrets if I prove untrustworthy." "Darling," Seraphine said, smiling with all her fangs showing, "whether you're trustworthy has nothing to do with it. You're a resource now, and resources have uses." The implied threat hung in the air like winter smoke. "There's another matter," Thaddeus said, his tone deliberately cutting through the tension. "The reason we came, aside from the delightful surprise of meeting the reincarnated prophet. Lysander, the Inquisitors are moving again. 3 cities reported sightings of the Hunters, the mortal organization that hunts us. They're using new methods, new weapons. There's rumor of a weapon that can harm even ancient bloodlines." Lysander's entire frame went rigid. "Where?" "Vienna. They've established a headquarters. They're gathering research, bloodline genealogies, ritual components." Thaddeus paused. "And they're looking for her. Specifically, apparently bloodline holders have properties that make them valuable to the Inquisitor's work. Your bound one is more wanted than you are, old friend." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Evangeline's feet. She was hunted. Not just by the vampire coven, but by mortal organizations that had somehow learned of her existence. "Then she stays protected," Lysander said, pulling her close. "She doesn't leave this manor. She doesn't expose herself. The coven will establish a watch. She's under my protection, which means she's under the coven's protection, whether Cassius agrees or not." "The Inquisitors don't recognize coven authority," Cassius said coldly, "and if the Hunters find her first, your protection won't matter." Outside, the blood moon continued its relentless rise, and Evangeline, newly bound, newly awakened, realized that her transformation would be far more dangerous than she'd imagined. That the past she was remembering wasn't just personal history, it was a map to secrets that multiple factions of immortals and mortals would kill to possess. She squeezed Lysander's hand and felt him squeeze back. Whatever came next, they would face it bound. The true transformation began on the 3rd night. It started with hunger. Not the gentle, manageable hunger Lysander had warned her about, but a gnawing, insistent need that made every mortal instinct scream for blood. She could smell it in servants' veins, could hear the pulse song of the groundskeeper moving through the manor grounds. It took every ounce of her willpower not to hunt. Lysander found her in the bathroom, gripping the sink so hard the porcelain cracked. "It's starting," he said quietly. "The transformation accelerates once the binding is complete." "How long?" "I don't know," Evangeline gasped. "How long until I—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Until she lost control. Until she became the monster she could feel awakening beneath her skin. "Come," he said, taking her hand. "We need to get you somewhere secure. You'll need blood soon, and you'll need to feed in a way that won't—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. That won't result in murder. He led her to the crypt beneath the manor. The green candles were already burning, and she realized with a start that she'd activated them unconsciously, drawn by instinct rather than intention. At the altar, the black stone chalice waited. "Drink," Lysander said, slicing his wrist with one elegant movement. The blood that welled up was dark and ancient, and the smell of it nearly made Evangeline lose her mind. She drank like an animal, pulling his wrist to her mouth, letting the immortal blood flow across her tongue. It was nothing like human blood. It was thick, complex, layered with memories and sensations. With each swallow she felt stronger, clearer, more herself and less herself simultaneously. When she finally pulled away, Lysander was watching her with something like wonder. "Your eyes," he whispered. Evangeline caught her reflection in the chalice's black stone. Her eyes had changed. The brown had deepened to black, with threads of crimson running through the pupil like blood in water. She looked exactly like the vampire women she'd seen in the manor's old portraits. "How long?" she asked again. "A few days, until the hunger becomes unbearable. A week or two until your body begins to reject sunlight entirely. A month, perhaps, until you have to make the final choice. Complete transformation or a slow death as you exist between states." "And you've been waiting centuries for this conversation," she said, hearing the bitterness in her own voice. "I've been waiting centuries for you to choose it willingly," he corrected. "That makes all the difference." Over the next 3 days, Evangeline's transformation accelerated. She stopped eating mortal food. The taste of it became ash in her mouth. She began seeing in perfect darkness, could hear heartbeats from the other side of the manor, could smell blood like a perfumer senses individual notes in a scent. And the hunger grew. Lysander provided animal blood to sustain her. Deer from the surrounding forest, carefully killed, brought to her in ceramic vessels. It helped, but barely. The animal blood was a palliative, not a cure. And the longer she went without human blood, the more her newly heightened senses began to betray her. On the third night, one of the servants, a maid named Catherine who'd always been kind to Evangeline, ventured too close to the library where Evangeline was trying to read Cordelia's journals for insight into the transformation. The girl's heartbeat was a drum, her blood was a song. Evangeline lunged. She would have killed her, would have drained her dry, if Lysander hadn't intervened. He pulled Evangeline away from the terrified girl with supernatural strength, shielding Catherine with his own body. "Run," he said to the maid, not taking his eyes off Evangeline. "Tell the others to leave the manor. Tell them to go to the village. Now." When Catherine had fled, he turned to Evangeline, and she saw no condemnation in his eyes, only understanding. Only the knowledge that this was the darkness at the heart of immortality, that at some point the hunger would override conscience, logic, civilization. "It's time," he said. "You have to complete the transformation, or the hunger will consume you. You'll become something mindless, an animal driven purely by thirst." "I don't want to kill," Evangeline whispered, horrified at herself. "I know." He took her hand and led her deeper into the manor, to a door she'd never noticed before. Behind it was a passage that descended into absolute darkness. Lysander lit it with a gesture, and green flames appeared along the walls, the same magic that lit the crypt. "But I've prepared for this moment, and I'm not asking you to kill." The passage opened onto a chamber she'd never seen before. It was beautiful in a terrible way, a cathedral of stone and shadow with arches carved from living rock. And in the center, bound in silver chains, was a man. He was conscious, aware, and terrified. His blood called to Evangeline like a siren's song. "Who is he?" she gasped. "A monster," Lysander said calmly. "A hunter's spy, sent to infiltrate our manor 3 months ago. I've kept him alive, waiting for a moment like this." A moment when I could offer you choice, the choice between control and madness. You want me to kill him? I want you to feed, Lysander corrected. His death is likely regardless. The hunters he serves would execute him for his failure. At least this way, his ending serves purpose. Serves you. Evangeline stared at the captive, at his terrified eyes, at the pulse in his throat that sang in frequencies only she could perceive now. And after I feed? After, you'll have a decision to make, Lysander said quietly. Finish the transformation, or pull back. Become fully immortal, or stay in the liminal space between, where hunger will always be your master. She closed her eyes, feeling the enormity of the choice. She could refuse, suffer through the hunger, cling to her humanity. But she already knew that path led nowhere. She'd felt it in the near attack on Catherine, the way her new nature was overriding her mortal conscience. She opened her eyes and looked at Lysander. If I do this, there's no going back. No, he agreed. But neither of us expected there to be. She turned to the captive, felt the hunger roar through her, and for the first time since the binding, she didn't fight it. She let herself be what she was becoming, a vampire, a hunter, a creature of darkness. The transformation completed as she fed, as her body accepted immortal blood fully, as the last fragments of her mortality were burned away by the fire of transformation. When she finally pulled back, gasping, the captive was dead. And Evangeline, the woman she had been, was gone. In her place was something new, something dark, something beautiful and terrible and absolutely, utterly immortal. Welcome, Lysander whispered, pulling her against his chest, to eternity. The Inquisitors came 2 days after Evangeline's complete transformation. They came with fire and steel, with weapons blessed by priests and rituals carved into silver bullets. They came in the pre-dawn darkness, when immortals should have been at their weakest, and they came with one singular purpose: retrieve the bloodline holder before the coven could consolidate power. Evangeline was still adjusting to her new existence when the first explosion shattered the manor's eastern wing. She woke, truly woke, for the first time in her immortal life, to the smell of burning wood and holy water. Her new senses were overwhelming, clarified, perfect. She could hear every member of the Inquisitors' strike team, 13 of them, moving through the manor with trained precision, carrying weapons that burned with silver light. Lysander was already moving when she stumbled from their chamber. He was fully transformed now, in a way she'd never seen. Not the elegant aristocrat, but the ancient predator beneath. His fangs extended with lethal grace. His eyes burned with centuries of rage. "Stay close," he commanded, and there was no room for argument in his tone. "They have weapons designed for our kind. The silver won't kill me, but it will slow me. You." He paused, seeming to reassess her. "You're fast. Faster than you realize. Use that. Use the element of surprise." The first Inquisitor came through the doorway with a crossbow loaded with silver bolts. Lysander moved to intercept, taking a bolt meant for Evangeline directly to the shoulder. She felt his pain as though it was her own. The binding had created a connection that transcended physical proximity. Without thinking, she lunged. The Inquisitor died before his next breath. She was efficient, brutal, and utterly devoid of the mercy that had once defined her. Her immortal instincts knew exactly where to strike, exactly how much pressure to apply. She was a weapon, newly forged, and she wielded herself with devastating precision. "Good," Lysander said, and there was pride in his voice, even as he ripped the bolt from his shoulder. "Now we run." The manor became a battlefield. The coven had arrived, Cassius and Thaddeus, along with a dozen others, all converging on the Inquisitors with centuries of experience and hunger on their side. But the hunters had come prepared. They'd clearly studied vampire physiology extensively. The silver worked. The blessed water burned. And they were systematic in a way that suggested this wasn't their first organized hunt. Evangeline found herself moving through the chaos with an instinct she didn't know she possessed. Kill or be killed. Protect the bound or die in the attempt. She was immortal now, which meant she could take damage that would fell mortals, could heal from wounds that should be fatal. She could fight like a god. She cornered one of the inquisitors in the library, the very library where this had all begun, where she'd cut her hand on ancient pages and called to Lysander through her blood. The man was older, grizzled, with scars that spoke of centuries of hunting. "You're the bloodline," he said, not with fear but with grim recognition. "The reincarnating one. I've been hunting your kind for 40 years. You're the first one I've ever actually seen." "Then you're lucky," Evangeline said, and her voice was exactly the same timbre as Lysander's, ancient, cold, utterly inhuman. "You get to say you saw one before I kill you." She didn't give him the courtesy of a quick death. Centuries of training, dormant in her blood, surfaced as needed. She was predator and prey, killer and hunted, and the Hunters' organization had made the mistake of coming to her home. When the battle finally ended, the manor was in ruins. 3 inquisitors were dead. 7 more were retreating, limping toward the fires they'd started in the East Wing. The Coven had taken casualties too. Thaddeus had a gaping wound in his side that would need days to heal, and several younger vampires had not survived their first battle with trained hunters. Evangeline found Lysander in the main foyer, surrounded by carnage. He was covered in blood, some his, most not, and his eyes held a fierce satisfaction that was utterly alien to the redemption-seeking man she'd bound herself to. "The hunters will return," Cassius said, stepping over the body of a dead inquisitor. "With more numbers, with better weapons. This was a test, I think. Seeing what you have, seeing if the bloodline holder was worth the resources." "Then we prepare," Seraphine said, and there was hunger in her voice that had nothing to do with blood. "A full trial. A Coven judgment. If the hunters are willing to wage open war, then the bloodlines must be invoked. Old laws, the Crimson Covenant." Evangeline felt Lysander's hand find hers. The connection between them thrummed with power, immortal power, the kind that could reshape reality if wielded with sufficient will. "The Crimson Covenant," Lysander repeated, and his voice carried the weight of ritual. "Ancient law invoked only when the survival of our kind is threatened." "Is it?" Evangeline asked. She was still learning what it meant to be immortal, still learning to interpret the weight of ancient knowing that lived in her blood. "Are we threatened?" "By the hunters, perhaps," Lysander said, "but more so by ourselves. If the Coven decides you're too dangerous, they can invoke the Sundering, a ritual that seals your bloodline from returning. It would break the cycle. Magdalena would never be born again." The horror of that possibility hit her like a physical blow. It meant eternity without return. It meant this lifetime would be her only chance to be with him, to exist in this binding. "Then we fight," Evangeline said simply. "For ourselves. For our bloodline. For every iteration of me that came before, and every one that comes after." Cassius laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, she'll do nicely. A bloodline holder with immortal conviction. The Coven will either destroy her or worship her, and I suspect worship is far more likely." "The trial convenes at the blood moon's full rise," Seraphine announced. "Neutral ground, the Crimson Cathedral beneath Vienna. Every bloodline with standing will attend, and we'll decide whether the princess and her fallen lord are saviors or damnation itself." Lysander pulled Evangeline close, and she could feel the tremor in his ancient body. Fear, worry. The knowledge that despite centuries of preparation, despite everything he'd done to become worthy of grace, this moment might be the one that costs them everything. Whatever happens, He whispered into her hair. "We face it together. Covenant bound and eternal." The manor burned around them, and Evangeline realized that this was the true nature of immortality. Not beauty or elegance, but consequence. Everything they did echoed through centuries. Everything they chose had ripples that affected fates and futures. 3 days until the trial. 3 days until the coven decided their worth. 3 days until immortal law would determine whether their love was blessing or curse. Vienna was a city of secrets. Its catacombs stretched beneath the cobblestone streets like a second civilization, ancient, intricate, and perfect for a trial that had to remain hidden from mortal eyes. The Crimson Cathedral was less a building than a statement, stone carved with such precision and patience that only immortals could have conceived it. Decorated with artwork spanning centuries, each painting a masterpiece that tracked the evolution of vampire culture from demon superstition to elegant darkness. Evangeline stood at the cathedral's threshold, dressed in garments Lysander had acquired for her, a gown of deep crimson that matched the blood moon hanging overhead, perfectly tailored to a woman who was no longer bound by mortal notions of age or propriety. 40 vampire bloodlines had gathered, representing thousands of years of combined existence, and all of them were watching her with hunger and curiosity and barely concealed hostility. "Stay behind me," Lysander murmured. His formal wear was black, aristocratic, exactly what a man of his age and standing would choose. "Don't speak unless directly questioned. Don't show fear. They'll sense it." "What are they deciding exactly?" Evangeline asked, though she'd spent the past 3 days reading Cordelia's journals for precedent. The Crimson Covenant was ancient law, designed to protect vampire bloodlines from internal extinction and external threat. "Whether you're a resource or a threat," Lysander replied. "Whether your transformation was a blessing or a mistake. And whether I'm worthy of redemption or worthy of destruction." The trial began at moonrise. A council of 7 stepped forward from the assembled crowd, the ancient ones, the bloodlines that had survived millennia. Seraphine was among them, along with a vampire so old he barely resembled anything human, with eyes that had seen the rise and fall of empires. "Lysander of Ravenscar," the eldest began, his voice resonating through the cathedral with supernatural authority. "You stand accused of an incomplete trial centuries ago. You were given 143 years to achieve redemption, to prove that a fallen one could earn grace. You were denied, and you chose to wait, rather than accept the sundering. Why should the Coven trust that your recent binding is anything but another attempt to circumvent our law?" "Because I have completed the trial," Lysander said, his voice steady. "I went 87 years without human blood. I saved lives instead of taking them. I became something more than the hunger that created me. And when the reincarnating bloodline returned, I honored the covenant by waiting for her choice rather than compelling her." "You compelled her?" Cassius interjected, his voice soft but dangerous. "She carries the bloodline memories. She knew you across lifetimes. The binding was inevitable, not chosen." "The binding was her decision," Evangeline said before she could stop herself. Lysander's hand tightened on hers, warning, but not rebuke. "Silence, bloodline," Seraphine commanded, but there was interest in her gaze. "Unless you're claiming voice in this trial?" "I am," Evangeline said. She stepped forward despite Lysander's attempt to hold her back. "The Crimson Covenant permits the accused to call witnesses. I'm invoking the bloodline testimony. I demand voice." The cathedral erupted in whispered conversation. It was uncommon for a newly transformed vampire to invoke ancient privilege, but not illegal. The laws had been written with foresight. They'd anticipated that bloodlines might reincarnate, might return with power. "Very well," the eldest said. "Evangeline of the returning line, speak. What is your testimony?" Evangeline felt Lysander's presence beside her. Steady, constant, terrified. She could feel his fear through the binding, his certainty that she was about to make a catastrophic mistake. "I came to this binding with 240 years of memories," she said, and her voice didn't shake. "I remember being Magdalena, choosing my faith over immortality. I remember being Cordelia, choosing mortality over the price of transformation. And I remember being born as Evangeline, awakening to the knowledge that across multiple lifetimes, the same love had called to me." She extended her hand and let the cathedral see her fully. Her immortal beauty, her darkness, the threads of red that ran through her eyes like blood in moonlight. "I didn't bind because Lysander compelled me," she continued. "I bound because every lifetime I've been the cautious one, the one who chose safety, the one who refused transformation. And every time I refused, the love remained. Unanswered, eternal, absolutely faithful." She turned to face the assembled bloodlines directly. "You're asking whether Lysander is worthy of grace. The answer is simple. I'm asking the same thing about myself. Every lifetime I've refused him. But this lifetime—" She paused. "This lifetime I'm not refusing. This lifetime I'm choosing to be worthy of a love that spans eternity." "She plays well," Cassius observed, "but memories can be falsified, bloodlines can be corrupted. How do we know she's not a hunter plant? How do we know this isn't all elaborate deception?" "Because I'll prove it," Evangeline said. She walked to the cathedral's center, to the ritual ground marked with ancient symbols. "Invoke the blood test. Let me open my bloodline fully. Let every vampire in this cathedral taste my memories, feel my truth. If I'm lying, you'll know immediately." Lysander made a sound that was almost a growl. "Evangeline, you can't—" But she was already moving. She drew a ceremonial blade from the altar, ancient silver, pulsing with magic. She cut her wrist and held it before the assembled bloodlines. One by one, they came forward. They drank. They experienced her memories. Some gasped at the vision of Magdalena's holy defiance. Some wept at Cordelia's impossible choice, and all of them felt the eternal return of love, the absolute consistency of Lysander's devotion across centuries. When the last vampire pulled away, even Cassius looked shaken. "She speaks truth," the eldest said, his ancient voice heavy with something like awe. "The bloodline is intact, the binding is genuine, and—" He paused, looking directly at Lysander. "The redemption is real. I feel it in her memories. You have been redeemed, Lysander of Ravenscar, for 87 years without human prey, for centuries of penance, for a love so constant that it transcended death and returned again." "Then the charges are dropped," Seraphine said, and there was genuine admiration in her voice. "The sundering is not invoked. The bloodline cycle continues, and the binding stands as valid covenant under crimson law." The weight that had been crushing Lysander seemed to lift. Evangeline felt it through the binding, the release of centuries of burden, the knowledge that he'd finally been deemed worthy. "However," Cassius said, his voice cutting through the moment of relief, "this trial invoked a secondary law. The hunters have opened war on our kind specifically to retrieve the bloodline holder. That makes this a covenant war, a recognized conflict where all bloodlines must participate. The question now becomes, do we defend the reincarnating line, or do we offer her to the hunters as a gesture of peace?" The cathedral fell silent. Even Evangeline, with her new immortal strength, could feel how precarious their position remained. "The hunters cannot be appeased through sacrifice," Lysander said coldly. "They'll take the bloodline and come for the rest of us. We defend her, or we fall, one by one." "Then we defend," the eldest said. "And we prepare for war." Evangeline felt Lysander pull her close, felt the absolutely perfect synchronicity of their breathing, their heartbeats, their eternal connection. They'd survive the trial. But survival wasn't victory. The real darkness was just beginning. The war came like winter, sudden, absolute, transforming the landscape into something unrecognizable. Lysander moved her from Vienna to an ancient estate in the Scottish Highlands, a fortress built centuries ago specifically to defend bloodlines from attack. It rose from mist and rock like something from a fever dream. Towers of dark stone, windows like watching eyes, walls inscribed with protective wards that burned the skin of hunters who dared approach. Evangeline spent her first weeks there adjusting to what immortality truly meant. Not just the physical transformation, though that was extraordinary. The strength, the speed, the way her senses had expanded to encompass dimensions of reality that mortals never accessed, but the emotional architecture of eternal existence. Time moved differently now. A day felt like a breath. A week felt like nothing. And as she walked the fortress corridors with Lysander, surrounded by other vampires preparing for a conflict that might span decades, she felt the full weight of forever settling onto her shoulders. "You're quiet," Lysander observed one midnight as they stood on the fortress ramparts, watching the mist roll across the Scottish Highlands below. "Regretting your choice?" "No," Evangeline said, and she meant it absolutely. "But I'm understanding what it costs." Cordelia refused immortality because she couldn't bear the thought of watching centuries pass, of seeing mortals she loved grow old and die. "I'm feeling the beginnings of that grief, and I've only been immortal for weeks." Lysander pulled her close, his cold, immortal skin against her cold, immortal skin. "There are compensations," he said softly. "You have me. You have centuries to discover what we can become together. You have bloodlines that will look to you for wisdom and power. You have an eternity to love you," Evangeline finished. "Yes. I'm beginning to understand how magnificent that might be." She turned in his embrace and kissed him, truly kissed him, not as a bound woman or a transformed immortal, but as someone who'd spent 240 years across 3 lifetimes waiting for this exact moment. The kiss tasted like blood and redemption, like ancient sorrow finding its home in unexpected grace. When they pulled apart, Lysander's eyes held tears, the first tears she'd ever seen from an immortal. "I've waited so long," he whispered. "I've been so afraid that you would refuse me again, that Evangeline would choose as Cordelia chose." "But I didn't," she said. "I chose differently, and I'm still choosing, every moment, every second of this eternal night. I choose you, Lysander. I choose us." The next phase of her transformation was different from the physical one. It was spiritual, intellectual, a slow merging of their consciousness that went beyond the binding's basic connection. Lysander shared his knowledge, centuries of accumulated wisdom, magical training that had been ancient when he first became immortal, secrets of the blood that could only be passed through true covenant. He taught her to manifest power through pure will, to speak to shadows and command them, to understand the symbolic language of blood magic that had protected vampire bloodlines since the beginning of their kind. "You're a natural," he told her, as she successfully created a blood ward around the fortress. A shield made entirely of her own power, sustained by concentration and will. "I've seen vampires take decades to master what you've learned in weeks." "Because I'm not just drawing on my own knowledge," Evangeline realized. "I'm drawing on Magdalena's holy training, Cordelia's decades of study. I'm drawing on all of it." "Yes," he said. "That's the gift of the reincarnating bloodline. Each iteration builds on what came before. You're not just immortal, Evangeline. You're cumulative. You're exponential." She could feel it, the knowledge settling into her bones, the power responding to her intention with perfect synchronicity. She was becoming something more than a simple vampire. She was becoming a pillar of her bloodline's strength. The first major attack came in winter, 6 months after her transformation. The hunters came with numbers and organization, 50 of them, moving through the Scottish night with blessed weapons and ritual preparations. But they'd miscalculated. They'd assumed the vampires would be afraid, would retreat, would protect only what was most precious. Instead, Lysander opened the fortress gates and went to war. Evangeline fought. Beside him, their consciousness so perfectly aligned that they moved as a single organism. When he struck, she anticipated and reinforced. When she needed strength, he provided it through the binding. They were unstoppable. Ancient vampire and reincarnating bloodline, united by centuries of love and the simple, absolute certainty that nothing could divide them. The hunters died or fled. Only 5 survived, limping back into the darkness with reports that would terrify their leadership. In the aftermath, standing in blood and ash, Lysander took her hand and led her to the fortress's innermost chamber. It was a room she'd never accessed, sealed behind wards that required both their power to open. Inside was the history of their love, rendered in physical form. Paintings of Magdalena and her Lysander, created by hands centuries dead, capturing the moment before the fall. Cordelia's journals, bound in leather and gold. Artifacts from across centuries. A ring Magdalena had worn, a cross Cordelia had used in ritual, objects that carried the weight of their previous unions. And at the center, on a pedestal of pure moonlight-colored stone, was the binding cup. "This is the original," Lysander said softly. "The cup from which we drank in 1642, the night I became what I am. For 393 years I've kept it here, in this place, waiting for the day when you would return, and we could bind not just through blood, but through covenant ritual." Evangeline understood immediately what he was asking. "The full covenant," she whispered. "Not just immortal binding, but soul binding, complete merging." "If you're willing," he said, "I won't ask again. This is your choice, made with full knowledge of what it means. If we complete the covenant, I won't just be able to feel your emotions or access your memories. We'll be one consciousness in 2 bodies. We'll never be truly separate again, not even in thought. It's the closest thing immortals have to becoming one being." She walked to the cup and picked it up. It was warm to the touch, pulsing with magic that had waited centuries for this exact moment. "Do you want this?" she asked. "After waiting so long, after suffering so much, do you really want to be completely merged with me? To lose the boundaries between yourself and mine?" "I want to be incapable of love for anyone else," Lysander said. "I want to be so completely yours that the universe forgets where I end and you begin. I want to spend eternity knowing that every thought in your head I'm aware of, that every heartbeat we share, that every moment we're perfectly understood." Evangeline brought the cup to her lips and drank from it. Then she offered it to him. He drank, and as he did, something profound shifted in the fabric of their reality. The boundary between their consciousness dissolved. She was him, and he was her. And they were both together as one infinite awareness that somehow retained individual identity. It was paradox, made manifest. It was transcendent and intimate and absolutely, utterly complete. "I love you," Lysander said, and Evangeline knew it with perfect certainty because she was thinking it simultaneously. Their words overlapped, becoming one voice. "I love you," Evangeline replied, and meant it with the force of centuries. They were bound now, not just as immortals, but as something the vampire world had no proper name for. Not quite the same being, but never again separate. The war continued around them. The hunters would attack again, the coven would face challenges, mortality would continue to bleed away under their eternal existence. But none of it mattered as much as this. Two souls, finally, after centuries of waiting, absolutely certain they were home. The prophecy came from an ancient source, a vampire seer who hadn't been seen in 2 centuries, pulled from retirement by the Crimson Council because the war was escalating towards something the councils had feared since the beginning of their kind: exposure. The hunters had accumulated enough knowledge to understand that vampires were real, organized, and powerful. They were preparing a final strike, not to capture Evangeline, but to destroy the entire network of immortal bloodlines. It was genocide, pure and simple, and it would require a response that could no longer be hidden from the mortal world. "There's a way to stop it," the seer, an ancient vampire named Theron, told the assembled council. His eyes held futures branching and converging, possibilities colliding. "But it requires a sacrifice." "No," Lysander said immediately, and Evangeline felt his refusal echo through their shared consciousness. They were a single defensive unit now, impossible to separate. "Whatever it is, we don't consent." "You have no choice," Theron replied calmly. "The prophecy is already in motion. One of you must stand at the convergence point, the place where the barrier between worlds grows thin. One of you must offer your own immortal life force to seal the rift that the hunters have opened. Without that sacrifice, they'll breach the final veil. They'll force exposure. Mortals will know we exist, and the resulting war will kill thousands of both our kinds before we're done." "Then I'll do it," Evangeline said. "No," Lysander replied, and his voice was absolute. "We'll discuss this," Theron continued, unmoved by their resistance. "But the choice isn't yours to make together. It's the seer's prerogative to invoke one name from the prophecy, and the name I see most clearly." He paused, his future sight eyes boring into Evangeline's consciousness. "Is yours." The weight of that declaration settled like stone. Lysander pulled her into their private consciousness, to the space where only their merged awareness could touch. "We'll find another way. There's always another way." "You know there isn't," Evangeline replied, and her voice held the certainty of bloodline knowledge. "You've lived long enough to understand destiny. We can fight it, but it won't change the outcome." "Then let me go instead. Let me give my life." "Your life isn't what's needed," she said softly. Theron said so. "It has to be me, a bloodline holder, someone who carries the memory of ages. My sacrifice will carry weight that yours wouldn't." They emerged from their shared consciousness to find the entire council watching them with the particular sympathy reserved for those facing inevitable doom. "How long?" Lysander asked Theron. 3 days until the convergence," the seer replied. "The hunters are gathering at the point of entry now. They'll make their push on the winter solstice, a time of maximum power for both bloodlines and mortal magic." Those 3 days were the most beautiful and terrible of Evangeline's eternal existence. Lysander didn't let her out of his presence for more than a moment. They spent their time in the fortress's private chambers, in the library, in the ancient crypt where they'd first bound. They made love with the desperate intensity of beings who were running out of time, each touch meaningful because it was one of the last they'd share in this configuration. And they talked, endlessly, sharing futures they'd never have, discussing the children they wouldn't create, planning a life together that would end in 3 days. "When you're reborn," Lysander said, "I'll find you again. I'll wait. I'll learn your name before you learn mine, and I'll court you properly. And I'll give you the lifetime together we deserve this time." "You can't be sure I'll return," Evangeline replied, though she felt it in her bones, the certainty that bloodlines cycled, that death wasn't permanent for those born with immortal blood. "I'm absolutely certain," he said, "because a love like ours doesn't end. It cycles, it returns. It waits patiently across eternities for another chance." On the final night, they went to the convergence point together, a place in the Scottish Highlands where the veil between worlds had always been thin. It was neither crypt nor cathedral, but something older. A natural formation of stone and water where ancient magic had pooled in the earth itself. The hunters were there, 50 of them, moving in ritual formation, preparing their final assault. But they weren't alone. The coven had come. Every bloodline that valued Evangeline's life, every immortal who understood what her death would prevent. Lysander and Evangeline stood before them both, mortals and immortals, gathered at the end of the world. "I'm ready," Evangeline said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. She walked to the convergence point center and began to pull her immortal force outward, the power that kept her eternal, the essence of her bloodline, the centuries of knowledge and memory that made her valuable and powerful and impossible to replace. It felt like dying, but transcendent. Like becoming, paradoxically, more alive as she surrendered everything that made her immortal. The sky above the convergence point began to tear, reality ripping apart as the hunters attempted their final breach. Evangeline felt the moment approaching when the veil would crack completely, when exposure would become unavoidable. And then her power, centuries of it, all at once, flowed into the rift. The barrier sealed, the veil held. The darkness was pushed back, and the hunters fell, their ritual disrupted, their final assault rendered futile. Evangeline collapsed as her immortality drained away. She could feel Lysander moving toward her, but she held up one hand to stop him. "Don't," she whispered. "If you hold me now, you'll know exactly how much I've loved you. You'll feel the magnitude of it. And I need you to let me go with grace, not with that knowledge crushing you." "I'll never let you go," Lysander replied, but he stopped at the edge of the convergence point. "I'll wait, Evangeline. I'll wait until you're born again." "I know," she said, and she smiled because she could feel it too, the certainty that this wasn't an ending but a transformation. "I'll remember you in my blood. I'll find you again. We'll have another 1,000 lifetimes together if we're patient." The mortality returned to her quickly now, rushing in to fill the spaces where immortality had lived. But it wasn't a degradation. It felt like coming home. She aged in fast forward, her immortal form sliding back to humanity, back to youth, back to the girl she'd been before the manor awakened her bloodline. The sun rose on the final night of her eternal existence, and it felt warm on her skin, something that hadn't been possible for her long, immortal winter. "Thank you," she whispered to Lysander, though he was at the very edge of her fading perception now. "Thank you for waiting, for loving, for being worthy of redemption." "Evangeline," he started, but her mortal hearing couldn't reach his voice anymore. She closed her eyes and let the darkness take her, knowing absolutely that it was temporary. Knowing that somewhere, a fallen prince would be waiting with perfect patience for her to be born again. The blood moon faded, the war ended, and love, in its infinite certainty, simply waited for the next beginning. Evangeline lived her mortal life, 57 years of it, unaware that an ancient vampire waited in the shadows of her existence, honoring a promise that transcended death and resurrection. She was born in 1889 to a merchant family in Edinburgh. She grew up learning languages, art, literature, the same gifts the previous iterations had carried. Sometimes, in mirrors, she saw blood that shouldn't be there. Sometimes she dreamed of green candles and a voice that called her name in languages she didn't consciously know. And sometimes, in crowds, she would see a man with storm-cloud eyes watching her with such infinite tenderness that her heart would break without knowing why. By the time she was 23 years old, Evangeline had accepted that there was something supernatural woven into the fabric of her existence. She began seeking out occult texts, studying bloodline mythology, following threads of knowledge that seemed to call to her from the very fabric of her being. She was in a rare bookshop in London when he found her. He was exactly as she'd seen him in dreams, beautiful, ancient, carrying centuries like a cloak, worn thin by time and sorrow. But this time, he approached openly, without supernatural intervention. "Evangeline?" he said, and the way he spoke her name contained the weight of all 3 lifetimes. "My name is Lysander, and I believe you've been waiting for me." She knew him immediately, not from memory. Her mortal mind couldn't access the details of past incarnations, but from something deeper. The recognition was cellular, absolute, inevitable. "I've been dreaming of you," she whispered. "Since I was small, a voice calling, a face I couldn't quite see." "I've been waiting for you," he replied, "since before you were born, since before the universe learned your name." They didn't rush this time. Lysander courted her as he'd promised, properly, with flowers and poetry and the careful romance of a man who understood that he had centuries to build a foundation, but only one mortal lifetime to make her love him as a man rather than as a destiny. He told her everything, the truth of what he was, what she was, what they could become together. And Evangeline, with the wisdom of 3 lifetimes living in her blood even if her conscious mind didn't remember them, chose to believe him. On her 25th birthday, she made the choice to become immortal again. This time, there was no battle, no war, no prophecy requiring sacrifice. Just 2 lovers in a crypt lit by green candles, offering their wrists to each other, binding themselves through blood and covenant with full knowledge of what eternity meant. "I remember now," Evangeline gasped as the transformation took her, as centuries of dormant memory flowed back into her consciousness. "Magdalena, Cordelia, the trials, the war. I remember all of it." "I know," Lysander whispered, holding her as she convulsed through the change. "Welcome home, my love. Welcome home." The story of the Crimson Covenant didn't end with Evangeline's sacrifice. It evolved. Lysander had kept his promise. He'd waited. And when she returned, he'd courted her with the patience of the eternally devoted. But more importantly, he'd changed during her mortal years. The war with the Hunters had ended after her sacrifice sealed the rift. The Coven had reorganized, drawing lessons from exposure's near miss, and Lysander had stepped into a role he'd never imagined himself suited for: leadership. As a vampire council member, guided by a century's worth of redemptive living, he'd shaped vampire society toward restraint, toward the building of sustainable immortality rather than predatory existence. He'd established safe houses where willing mortals could sustain the bloodlines without dying. He'd created laws that protected reincarnating bloodlines and honored the covenant bonds that were becoming increasingly common among the immortal elite. When Evangeline returned and transformed, she found herself not just at Lysander's side, but at the center of a movement, a new order of vampires attempting to reshape their entire civilization. The old way was hunger and fear, Lysander told her as they stood in the Crimson Cathedral a year after her transformation. The ancient hall had been restored, beautified, filled with modern vampires seeking to understand their nature differently. "We were demons because we accepted the role, but you, both iterations of you, showed us another way. A way where love could matter as much as hunger. Where redemption was possible even for the utterly damned." "We did this together," Evangeline replied, and she meant it not just about their current life, but about all of them, every iteration of their love, every lifetime building on what came before. The prophecies came again, centuries later, in different forms. Seers spoke of the eternal lovers, the binding pair. the ones whose covenant had fundamentally altered the trajectory of vampire civilization. Books were written, carefully coded, hidden in rare collections protected by magic, documenting their story. But Lysander and Evangeline weren't interested in legend. They were interested in the simple, profound miracle of continuity. They had a daughter, a vampire born of their union, carrying blood that was part reincarnating bloodline and part ancient immortal. She was extraordinary and terrible in equal measure, and they loved her with a fierceness that only those who'd waited centuries could understand. They had lovers, friends, an extended family of chosen vampires who looked to them for guidance and grace. They built sanctuaries. They shaped policy. They tried, with every century that passed, to create a world where immortality could be beautiful rather than destructive. And through it all, they remained bound, conscious merged with conscious, heart with heart, two beings who'd learned across multiple lifetimes that love transcended death, resurrection, transformation, and the simple passage of eternities. In the present day, 1,000 years after the first binding, 500 years after the sacrifice that sealed the rift, Evangeline stands in their private crypt, looking at all the iterations of their story rendered in art and artifact, and the lived memory of immortal existence. Lysander approaches from behind, pulling her close in a gesture that's become their perfect signature. "What are you thinking?" he asks, and he already knows. Their consciousness is so merged that the boundary between thought and speech is almost meaningless. "That I was right," she replies. "Every time I made the choice to love you despite the cost, I was right." "Yes," he agrees, "and I was right to wait." They stand together as the green candles burn around them. Candles that have been lit continuously in one location or another for over 1,000 years. Outside, the mortal world continues its existence, oblivious to the immortal civilization thriving in its shadows. The war with the hunters has become footnote. The prophecies that once seemed apocalyptic have been absorbed into the normal flow of vampire history. And at the center of it all, two beings. One fallen nobility seeking redemption, one reincarnating bloodline seeking home, prove with every moment that the most powerful magic in any world, mortal or immortal, is love, willing to wait forever. The blood moon rises again, as it always does, and they rise with it, hand in hand, heart to heart, eternal in every way that matters. A young vampire came to their crypt-seeking council. She was newly transformed, born from mortal stock, carrying none of the ancient bloodline legacy that made Evangeline and Lysander's love almost incomprehensible to ordinary immortals. Her name was Seraphina, the latest iteration of a name that would cycle through centuries of reincarnation, though she didn't know that yet. And she was desperately afraid that her transformation was a mistake, that her mortality hadn't truly prepared her for eternity. Lysander received her while Evangeline watched from the shadows, a gesture of trust, of allowing each to find their own voice in their ancient partnership. "Tell me," Lysander said, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 years of wisdom, "why you think eternity is a burden rather than a gift." "Because I'll never see my family again," Seraphina replied, her voice breaking with fresh grief. "Because everyone I love will age and die, and I'll be left behind watching centuries of death march past my eyes. How is that a gift?" Evangeline stepped from the shadows then, and Seraphina gasped. The younger vampire could feel the weight of her bloodline legacy, the accumulated power of resurrections and covenant bonds. "Come with me," Evangeline said. She led Seraphina to the ancient paintings on the crypt walls, the ones that documented the first binding, the first lifetime, the moment when love had transcended damnation. "Do you know this story?" Seraphina shook her head. "It's the Crimson Remembrance," Evangeline explained. It's the story of a woman who refused immortality because she loved someone who was damned, and she didn't want to live forever with that knowledge. So she chose to die, knowing she'd return, knowing he'd be waiting. She pointed to the next painting, Cordelia, choosing mortality again, refusing the transformation a second time. And then, Evangeline continued, she was born again. In this lifetime. Me. And I had the exact same choice my predecessors had. I could refuse him. I could protect myself from the pain of immortality. I could choose the safe, mortal path. She turned to face Serafina directly. But I didn't. Not because immortality doesn't carry cost. It does. Terrible cost. But because the cost of a lifetime without him was far greater than the price of eternal existence with him. Is that always how it works? Serafina asked tentatively. Do we always get another chance? For bloodlines like ours, yes, Evangeline said. We return, again and again. Our consciousness cycles back into new bodies, new lifetimes, new possibilities. And if you're very fortunate, if you love someone with enough absolute certainty, you'll find them waiting. She brought Serafina back to where Lysander stood, and he extended his hand. The gesture was simple, but it contained so much. Centuries of longing, the absolute patience of immortal devotion, the profound knowledge that love could wait forever and find itself rewarded. Immortality is not a gift, Lysander said quietly. It's a responsibility, a long responsibility. But if you spend your centuries creating beauty instead of destruction, if you love someone with intention rather than convenience, if you build meaning into your eternal days rather than simply enduring them, then perhaps it becomes something worth the cost. Serafina took his hand, and Evangeline wrapped an arm around her, and for a moment, the crypt filled with a kind of light that had nothing to do with candles. It was the light of covenant, of binding, of three beings connected through blood and intention, and the fundamental understanding that immortality was only bearable if you shared it with someone worth the forever. Outside, the blood moon reached its zenith, and inside the ancient crypt, the crimson remembrance continued, not as a finished story, but as an ongoing testament to the power of love willing to span eternities. The green candles burned on as they always would, forever illuminating the altar where two souls had learned that damnation could lead to grace if the heart remained true. In the end, that was the only magic that truly mattered. Not immortality, not power, not covenant bonds or bloodline legacy. Simply this: two beings, refusing to lose each other across every lifetime, in every incarnation, proving that love was the only immortality that actually meant anything.